He came prepared to discuss his most recent book, which is on business ethics. So we'll have to have him come back next time to discuss that. And we hope he remembers what he wrote in this book. I think he will. So let's begin with prayer. Dear God, thank you for the Sabbath school, for the summer day, for Gary, how much he's meant to us over the decades. We pray that we will take full advantage of his skill and knowledge and dedication to truth today. In Christ's name, amen. So, I would like to begin with this, Gary. This is from Romans, 2nd chapter. All who have sinned apart from the law will also perish apart from the law. And all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous in God's sight, but the doers of the law who will be justified. Here's the part. When Gentiles who do not possess the law do instinctively what the law requires, these, though not having the law, are a law to themselves. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, to which their own conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts will accuse or perhaps excuse them on the day when, according to my gospel, God through Jesus Christ will judge the secret thoughts of all. Now, it's a little unfair to ask you too much about this book because you came prepared to discuss another book, but let's begin with the title of this book. And since you haven't seen it before, I invite you to handle your own book.
This is great. You know, I was told the book would be available in the U.S. beginning at the end of this month. My author copies haven't arrived, so it's great from my point of view that I can actually pick this up. And Dave gets extra credit as a friend for ordering a copy, his own initiative. So
I feel very good for having anticipated the author in reading this version of the book. So the book is called Flourishing Lives and Exploring Natural Law and, not Natural Law and Liberalism, but Natural Law Liberalism. That's a very important difference. Natural Law Liberalism. So Flourishing Lives. Those are three key words: flourishing, natural law, and liberalism. And I thought maybe we could explore each of these a bit together this morning. Maybe I could begin, Gary, by making a comment and asking a question, and that is, you have written this book and other books on the theme of natural law.
that's true.
And you also know that natural law theories are not very popular in many places.
That's also true. Yeah.
And I therefore wonder if you could tell us why they're not very popular, and then why, despite their unpopularity in a number of places, you have chosen to make natural law a centerpiece in your thought.
So, a natural law theory can be defined in different ways, but I take a natural law theory to be one that emphasizes that human flourishing is at the heart of ethics, and that to think about what it is to be a good human is to think about what flourishing or fulfillment looks like, and that there's at least an important analogy between talking in these terms about human lives and talking in the same ways about the lives of other animals, or indeed of non-animals. When we talk about what it is for a tree to flourish, we have some idea of what that involves. We have an idea of what it is for a dog to flourish. And we're saying really the same kind of thing, that ethics fundamentally, when we talk about what it is for humans to choose well, is for humans to live well, to live flourishing lives. And then there are some other elements that often show up in natural law theories, in addition to this concern with flourishing. It's a sufficiently complex topic that everybody's got a different, kind of a different take. Sorry about that. But, I think natural law theories have been unpopular for, probably for several reasons. I can identify three immediately. The first is that natural law theories are often taken to have religious roots, and in a context in which religion is seen as socially mischievous, a source of conflict or a source of oppression, people often resist natural law theories because of their religious connections. Even though the focus is immediately on flourishing and well-being, it's often thought that at a deeper level, natural law theories refer to God the Creator in a way that some people find troubling. So that's one element. Another factor, not just the religious roots, but also I think the idea that natural law theories focus on flourishing, meaning that they've got a substantive conception of what counts as a good life. I think that's also often a source of resistance, because a lot of times people worry that this is going to be an occasion for some sort of paternalism, right? That if there's, some lives go well and others don't, then somebody will regard that as a good reason to tell other people what to do for their own good. And so I think there are worries of that kind sometimes about natural law theories. Another kind of worry that often arises about natural law theories is that such theories are law theories. That is to say, that they do suppose that there are continuities in the moral life that are pretty substantial. And I think we're in an era in which people are very sensitive to context, and they often tend to resist the idea that there might be, as it were, generic moral truths. So suppose, for instance, that one thinks, as I'm inclined to think, that purposefully attacking non-combatants is always wrong, or that torture is always wrong. Those are claims that involve these sort of generic moral ideas that are true across context. Whatever else is true about an instance of torture, it's an instance of deliberately causing severe pain, let's say, or something like that. And so these generic features may be, on a typical natural law view, will be sufficient to rule out certain kinds of choices, and people in a moral environment like ours that's very context sensitive can be quite suspicious of these attempts to talk in generic terms about moral matters. There's some other things we can say, but I think those are some key reasons why there's been a lot of suspicion in recent decades directed at natural law theories. So why then, Dave asks, do I have some interest in this? Probably in part because I'm a contrarian and like the fact that other people don't like the theories. In part, I think, because I think there's something rich and evocative precisely about this concern with flourishing. In part, I think, because natural law theories offer, by far, the most interesting and important and persuasive rejoinder to utilitarian and consequentialist ways of thinking, which I certainly would like to resist. In part, I think, because I grew up in a religious context in which the religious undertones of natural law thinking didn't seem, troubling, but in fact, natural law thinking seemed like probably the best and most sensible and most moderate way of spelling out what those religious themes that I grew up exposed to, might look like. Sorry about that.
Let's see.
Yeah.
I'm just looking here to see who might have access to water. Okay. Maybe I can give my wallet to somebody who can get into the School of Religion and get us a bottle of water. Would that be okay?
Sorry about that, folks.
That's all right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so while Gary's taking advantage of that, let me just summarize things in my own words until we can get him back on board here, and that is, if I look at a basic textbook in bioethics, they'll usually say there are two ways of making decisions. One of them would be to say something like, right actions are right because they produce good results, and wrong actions are wrong because they produce bad results. So there's a whole family of theories there that we can call consequentialist. On the other hand, there are theories that are more or less, they're usually called Kantianism, but I suppose we might call them formalism, that say right actions are right because they are logically self-consistent, and wrong actions are wrong because they contradict themselves, or something like that. Now, where do natural law theories fit? And interestingly enough, many bioethics textbooks just plain leave them out because they are so unpopular. And I think that that's most unfortunate, because natural law theories are quite prevalent in Roman Catholic institutions. And 1 patient in 6 this morning, 1 patient in 6 is in a Roman Catholic hospital. And Roman Catholic people are providing so much medical care that if they pulled out of the national healthcare system, our system would implode, literally implode. And yet, natural law theories are very prominent amongst Roman Catholic thinkers and Roman Catholic clinicians, and therefore we should know something about natural law theories. Now, true, they are unpopular, and that's why they don't even show up in major textbooks on bioethics, but nevertheless, I think we have an investment, not only because Roman Catholics reason this way, but in fact, Adventists do too. If I think of what category Dr. Provantius thought would be, it would be one version of natural law theory.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, let me go back to your definition of natural law theories in this book, which I think was really great. You said something like, these aren't the exact words, but something like, natural law theories think, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Robert.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Natural law theories say that the moral life is related in some way to how things actually are.
That seems right to me, yeah.
Okay? What we are expected to do is related to somehow to the way things actually are. Are there other theories that would say the moral life does not have to be related to the way things actually are?
Yeah, so that's obviously at a really high level of generality. And for instance, if a Kantian theory focuses in some narrow way on respect or on self-consistency, these are certainly aspects of reality, and there's a sense in which you'd clearly want to say this is a concern with how things are. A consequentialist clearly says, I'm just taking into account all of these empirical data and constructing a moral theory accordingly. So, in some sense, it's hard to think of a theory that's not concerned with how things are. But a natural law theory, in particular, I think, is interested in a really full-orbed appreciation for how a human life can go well or fail to go well. I mean, that's, so when I think about how things are, I'm interested in all of the different ways in which human lives can fail, or in which they can succeed, in which they can thrive. And so if I'm to capture at least the sort of natural law approach I'm interested in, synonyms like thriving and flourishing and fulfillment all, I think, begin to capture the sort of comprehensive approach I'm interested in. It's not just about, as with utilitarianism, satisfying people's preferences or, feeling pleasure or feeling happiness. It's not, as in a Kantian view, just in respecting rational nature. These things are important, but there's a broader and more comprehensive understanding.
Okay. If you want to, you can open up that bottle while I say something else. So the notion of flourishing is central to Gary's thinking. In addition to that, however, and I think really important, is that he identifies a number of basic goods. These are essential ingredients of a flourishing life. Let me put it that way. And these basic goods are basic in the sense that there is nothing more important than they are. They're basic in the sense that they aren't ranked in some hierarchy, some more important than others. They're all equally basic. They're basic in the sense that they cannot be changed and modified in ways without destroying what they are. Now, what are some of these basic goods? And Gary's book here begins by saying something like, I think we can get swift agreement, again, not the exact words,
Yeah.
the idea. I think we can get swift agreement that the following things are basic goods. And you don't set out to prove that these are basic goods in any way, but you suggest that, well, okay, if we talked about it, most of us would agree that these are the ingredients, the basic, the necessary ingredients of a well-lived life. Okay, what are some of those basic goods?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, again, I don't suppose that this is an exhaustive or a perfect list or that other categories wouldn't work, but, you know, I think a kind of standard list might include the following: life and bodily well-being, knowledge, practical reasonableness, the coherence or self-integration of a life, play, aesthetic experience, religion, friendship, sensory pleasure, you know, probably a few others, but those are ones
Sure.
that
So
immediately occur.
the key point is that we have this list, and it will never be exhaustive, but there are these items to which we would say, without that, a human life really is not a flourishing life. Correct?
Well, we want to be careful about that, because I want to say we recognize all of these as instances of flourishing, but it's not somehow the case that the kind of natural law theory I want to defend commits us to the view that every life has to include all of these. That is to say, I think one can live well, even, if you will, in the technical sense of the word, eccentrically. You know, one can choose, you know, perhaps one really, you know, obsesses about the interpretation of Greek poetry, and one puts a lot of other things to one side. A life would not be a flourishing life, on my view, if it involved the deliberate rejection of any of these as not valuable, or even worse, involved actual attacks on them. But one can certainly prioritize, one can certainly choose some to the effective exclusion of others. And so I don't want to suggest that a life has to be, in some simple sense, well-rounded in order to be a flourishing life.
Okay, I think, take that. That's a very helpful corrective to what I said. Now, it does seem to me this is clinically relevant. That is, I think a clinician must have some view of what a flourishing life looks like, and would be guided by that in light of what patients may request. Patients sometimes request things that would not contribute to a flourishing life. And I think a physician or any kind of clinician would be, at that point, ready to say, no, I'm not going to deafen your children's ears just because you're deaf, and you want your child to grow up in the non-hearing community. No, we're not going to do that, because that is not part of a flourishing life. And yet those kinds of questions and issues do emerge.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So this is very, very practically important. Now let's turn to the whole issue of liberalism. Because that's a kind of a, not slippery, but it's a complex term. And you identify three forms of liberalism. You identify classical liberalism and modern liberalism, excuse me, and radical liberalism. And you identify yourself with radical liberalism rather than modern or classical. So, could you tell us a bit about those three, and then help us understand why you choose radical liberalism?
Yeah, so let's talk first of all about what we mean by liberalism more generally, right? So we're not talking here per se about that term as it shows up in American political discourse, and it's really important to emphasize that. That's not the focus here. Liberalism, as historians of ideas and political philosophers talk about it, is a much broader category of social and political and moral theorizing and practice that can be seen as having a bunch of complementary roots, but I suppose especially dependent, especially emergent from the European cultural shifts that occur during and after the wars of religion, right? So there's the sense that there are these really devastating, you know, decades-long conflicts that draw lots of blood, you know, waste lots of resources, and you know, just generally devastate European life for an extended period after the Reformation. And liberalism really is, in part, the political theory that emerges in the wake of this, rooted in the question, how can we avoid killing each other over religion? You know, I mean, that's, in a sense, the most fundamental question that lies at the root of, I think, of liberalism. And so the goal then for the initial theorists of liberalism is to say, how can we have a rational kind of moral and social order that doesn't sort of implicate appeals to religious authority, and so that we can in fact get along with each other despite our differences with regard to religious matters. So that's one important aspect of liberalism's roots. Also, I think there's the sense that we get in late medieval Europe of a kind of dispersed array of authorities, and I think, you know, sometimes liberalism may hark back to that in contrast to the absolute monarchism that emerges kind of at the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the Renaissance. There's also then, I think, an increasing awareness of the value of spontaneous social orders as these come to expression you know, in market relations. We see this in the Scottish Enlightenment, thinkers like David Hume and Adam Smith. And then a kind of further wrinkle, which we get probably more with somebody like John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, is the idea of recognizing and celebrating individual diversity. And the idea that we want a social order that creates room for the expression of very different ways of being human, and not just with reference to particular groups, but with reference to the unique situations of particular individuals. So, broadly speaking, then, when I talk about a broad liberal tradition in political philosophy, you know, this is, again, it's not per se about what we have, let's say, that, you know, the way in which the term liberal has been adopted by particular strands of American, you know, political participants, but really instead about this broader idea of a rational, non-conflictual, egalitarian political order in which there's, you know, considerable space for freedom and for self-cultivation and so forth.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I really want to emphasize the point you just made, okay? So liberalism in your book does not refer to Adventism, Adventists who watch movies in the cinema before they watch them at home on their TV, right?
That's really not the
That's not what you're talking about. Neither is liberalism the Democratic Party.
Yeah, yeah.
Actually, the kind of liberalism you're talking about is almost the reverse. And here's
more
where,
complicated, yeah. I think
this is where your theory is very, very interesting, because that's where, yes, as you say, it gets more complicated. Okay, back to the three forms of liberalism.
Okay, so within the liberal tradition, we have stages of development and different ways in which things work out. So the classical liberal tradition, which we might, you know, associate, at least in the English-speaking world, with, you know, people over the course of, say, 150 years, particularly from, you know, Hume and Smith at the beginning to John Stuart Mill at the end, is, in pretty straightforward terms, politically individualist and interested in self-organizing, bottom-up structures for economic life. It really resists, as we find in Smith, the use of political privilege on the part of those who are the king's cronies to, you know, to organize the economy. Mercantilism, as Smith wants to emphasize, gets pitched as for the benefit of the society, but really is for the benefit of the king's cronies. And ordinary people are best served when the economy's open. Meanwhile, we get increasingly, certainly in people like Mill, the idea of the importance, again, of individual self-development, but also of things like freedom of expression. And so classical liberalism, again, then, is pretty straightforwardly individualist and anti-authoritarian. What we get toward the end of the 19th century in both England and the US is the emergence of you know, what is sometimes called modern liberalism. One wag refers to it as high liberalism, but I think that's intended kind of ironically. And so that modern liberalism, I think you can see as rooted in the view that the underlying concerns of the classical liberals look different in the context of modern industrial society, and for the typical modern liberals, then what we needed was not bottom-up self-organizing social orders, but instead social orders driven often from the top by experts. Progressivism in the early 20th century US and Fabianism in England in this period really emphasize expert authority. And the idea is very often, as we get in somebody like J.K. Galbraith, the idea of countervailing power, that private economic organization has become so socially influential that state power is needed as a kind of counterweight to it. So the radical approach that I'm inclined to defend in this book, perhaps provocatively with that title, is inclined to say, so let's embrace the liberal tradition enthusiastically, and let's ask whether the concerns and the goals of the modern liberals really can, contrary to what the modern liberals themselves often seem to think, be met more effectively using precisely the tools and the methods of the classical liberals, but perhaps pushed in a more consistent and thus more radical direction.
Now we get into the part that always makes me wince just a little bit, and that is radical liberalism also means, or at least entails, anarchy. And when I think of anarchy, I think of people running down the streets in total lack of self-control and on and on and on. And yet you are an anarchist, a thoroughgoing anarchist, and I don't think of you as acting that way. So what do you mean when you say radical liberalism entails, maybe does not necessarily require, but it entails anarchism?
Yeah, so I think, propaganda is a wonderful thing, and propagandists, from the beginning of the 20th century gave us this picture of the bomb-throwing anarchist. The people I think of as intellectual forebears are the so-called Boston anarchists, the American individualist anarchists of the 1870s, 1880s, people like Benjamin Tucker and Lysander Spooner, who never threw bombs at anybody, and spent their time writing tracts and producing magazines and so forth. So this is not a book about anarchism. That's not really the focus of the book. I've written 2 other books on that topic, and I direct readers to those for more detail on this issue. But this book really is about a range of other kind of more kind of in the trenches issues in ethics, law, and politics. So I don't want to dwell too much on the issue of anarchism, except to say that anarchy is not opposition to rules; it's opposition to rulers, and I think that's a pretty crucial distinction. The fact that there aren't rulers, that there's not authoritarian top-down control, doesn't mean there isn't bottom-up social order. And indeed, I think the best arguments for anarchism proffered by today's economists are precisely arguments that self-organizing social systems do a better job of what they do than do Hobbesian leviathans.
Well, I think that's great. I hadn't heard that. Anarchists are not against rules, they're against rulers. That's very helpful to me. But it is, I'll take your point that this is not a book about anarchism, but this book does touch on it, and it does say things like the state is something really bad. I mean, government's really bad, and you are not the least bit shy in saying that. Government is the bad thing. And so help me understand that, because when I think of government, I think of things that are quite helpful. I drove down the hill on a freeway today that the government provided.
Yeah, right. The fact that governments are notoriously abusive and corrupt and violent and dangerous doesn't mean they never do helpful things, right? I mean, that's, but I would say, roughly speaking, and again, not to get sidetracked on this because it's not the focus of the book, but I would say there are basically 3 points that I want to make about states. First of all, in the U.S. political context, we have at the root of our political culture the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence famously says that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. So point number 1 is the governed haven't consented. Really the bottom line, that the degree to which any system of political authority rests in practical terms on the consent of real people, the degree to which the ability of those systems to assert authority over an individual, rests on that individual's consent, that's minimal or non-existent. And of course, there's, not only the problem that many people just can't ever be said to have consented in any way, but there's also the fact that when other people have perhaps done things that could be treated as instances of consent, the difficulty is, of course, that if you don't consent, you're in a great deal of trouble, and so it's not clear that the consent means a whole lot, right, even for those people. So that's number one. Consent of the governed, I think, is not there. So there's a lack of legitimacy. This has been acknowledged, I think, very widely in the last 2 decades in political philosophy, by people, including by people who would not themselves, actually want stateless societies. They just don't think that there's, that appeals to consent are successful. So that's one point. The second, I think, is that states are tremendously dangerous, and we can look at the ways in which the truly awful things that have happened in the 20th century are characteristically the work of states. The historian R.J. Rummel has talked about this using the troubling word democide. States, are guilty of immense quantities of democide throughout the 20th century. And that's not surprising because states exercise, in Weberian terms, as using Max Weber's well-known definition, the states exercising at least an attempted monopoly of violence. So if it controls the means of violence, it's not very surprising that large-scale violence is largely the work of states. But states do other things that are pretty awful, and I try to catalog a number of these in my academic book, Anarchy and Legal Order, and my kind of more popular book, The Conscience of an Anarchist. Just a range of ways in which states are rapacious. They steal resources, redirect them to privileged elites, cause all kinds of difficulties culturally, economically, and so forth, all as a result of their acts of violence. And then finally, I would say, somebody might think, well, all of that's right, but we're going to kill each other if we don't have states. This is the sort of Hobbesian argument that life absent a monopolist of violence will be, as Hobbes famously puts it, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And but I think there's good both empirical and theoretical evidence, just empirical observation and theoretical argument, from a lot of work by fine economists, highlighting ways in which social self-organization, happens in the absence of monopolists. So.
Thank you. Now let's go to some of the practical issues you discuss in this book. There is an introductory theoretical chapter, and then you take up several different practical issues, and one of them has to do with grading, of all things, and another one has to do with lying, another one has to do with believing, and there you're talking about a kind of religious or theological understanding of the United States, things like that. And another one on intervention, which has to do with war and other things like that. So we don't have time to get into all of those, but maybe I can say something quite personal about this. Last night I had a kind of a transformation after having reading your chapter on lying.
Yeah.
And it says basically, I think what I have been inclined to say after you've worked your way through it very carefully, that we really ought not to lie, but there may be the occasion where lying is justifiable. And it just occurred to me, I've said that for years, but I don't think I believe it, as of last night. I think that, as of last night, I think lying is always wrong.
Okay.
Unless one doesn't care about the relationship continuing. If one hopes that the relationship will continue in any way, it seems to me that any act of deception destroys that. If you and I are friends, and once I find out that you have lied to me, I don't know how we can be friends, at least friends in the same way again. Now, if you are an assailant and I don't care anything about seeing you again, to lie to you doesn't bother me very much. But it does seem to me one of the basic goods is friendship, and that lying is a dagger into the heart of friendship. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that lying is indeed a dagger in the heart of friendship. That seems right to me. So what I do in this chapter, let's be really clear, is not develop a general theory of lying. What I'm doing is talking about particular natural law arguments about lying. And what I try to show is that so the traditional natural law view has been, broadly speaking, the view of St. Augustine, which is also the view of Kant, which is that all acts of intentional lying are in principle unreasonable. There is never a time, under any circumstances, when it is reasonable to make a knowingly false assertion. So the natural law theorists I consider offer several different arguments for that view, and what I do in the chapter is to try to show why I'm not persuaded by those arguments. Okay, I don't think that's in any way inconsistent with recognizing the real damage that a lie can do to an intimate relationship in just the way you suggested, Dave. I completely agree with you that. I mean, I think I have to stop and think about this. I'm quite certain that there are instances I could come up with of having been lied to that certainly have not been empirically disruptive in the way that I think we might worry they would be. But I'd certainly rather they hadn't happened, and I agree completely that lies disrupt relationships.
Okay, thank you. What would you like to say about grading? And let me just observe that as we were driving down the hill, I mentioned to my wife the various things you think should not be done in a classroom, and she said, well, that's the way you teach.
Well, I'm glad I could provide this, reinforcement for your...
So everything I do in class, not everything, but a number of things I do in class, you say I shouldn't do. Like giving people credit for attending, like taking into account their politeness in class, like what else? Like showing an interest in the topic and respect for the teacher, things like that, But all of that, you say, really, Dave, you shouldn't be doing that. Go ahead.
Yeah. So. What I want to suggest is that a grade is a pretty sort of impersonal measure floating out there that is first and foremost for the benefit of that generic figure I'll call a transcript consumer. Okay, so somebody who takes the transcript and has to do something with it, decide whether to admit a student to a graduate program, decide whether to hire a student, and so forth. And that person, it seems to me, obviously is aware, as most of us are, that different factors go into contributing to grades, but that person also needs to be able to assume a fair amount of precision in terms of what's there if the grade's going to be helpful to that transcript consumer. And so my suggestion is that there are all sorts of different things that go on in classrooms that we might reasonably be concerned with, and we might well want institutional mechanisms that allow us to deal with all those different things. But it's not clear that grading is the right mechanism to deal with all of them, right? And so my suggestion is that we think about grading as communicating information about a student's, the term I guess I used a slightly different term in this book, but in general, I've used the expression subject matter competence. I think I just say competence in small caps in this book to capture that. So subject matter competence. So the point of the grade is to give the transcript consumer information about subject matter competence. And if that's what you're trying to do with a grade, then the various other things that people sometimes try to do with grades serve to obscure what we know about subject matter competence and may even positively mislead And so I'd like to encourage that laser-like focus with respect to the grade on subject matter competence. Doesn't mean we can't have any number of other mechanisms, including mechanisms that might include something on the transcript. I'm happy if there'd be a notation on the transcript that says, you know, this person is, you know, a great participant in class discussion, or this person is really a pain. But that's separate, I think, from the question of the grade as a reflection of what the student's competence is with respect to the subject matter of the course.
When you were in elementary school, did you have a grade like we did called citizenship? That was different from the academic issues, but citizenship grade meant you were a halfway decent person in class.
Yeah, that sort of thing, that's the kind of distinction I guess I'm not opposed to, right? Because it's clear what that is. That's a grade that's focused on what sort of person you are to interact with, and that's all it is. And I think pulling that out enables us then to make sure the math grade isn't also a citizenship grade.
Okay, that's a very good distinction. Now, let's go to boycotts, then we'll get other people involved.
Yeah.
You talk about boycotts and whether they're morally justified and so forth, and you use the case of boycotting against the eating of meat. And you go through a lot of arguments about that, but a considerable amount of your chapter is devoted to the question, if I don't eat meat, will it make any difference? And to the overall number of animals that are tortured and killed. And the answer is no. If I don't eat if I never eat a chicken for the whole of the year, the number of chickens that are slaughtered and tortured is going to be hardly affected. So, and then after going all the way through, right toward the end you say, well, I'm not really in favor of symbolic actions. But then you say, I don't eat meat as a protest. Now, first of all, why go through that whole issue about whether my not eating a chicken makes any difference? And then what's wrong with a symbolic action, and how does that differ from a protest?
Yeah. So, I'm interested in the issue of when a boycott is required, right? That's what I start with. And so the question, when is a boycott required, I think, is best grappled with using the tools provided, I suggest, by so the natural law tradition, particularly in its Catholic theological moralist guise, talks about this in terms of cooperation with evil, okay? And there's more we can say about cooperation with evil, but roughly speaking, I would say the problem of cooperation with evil arises, you know, in various ways when we intersect with choices made by others that we judge to be unreasonable, and we might act ourselves unreasonably in relation to those choices in two cases, broadly speaking, two kinds of cases. First of all, I might act unreasonably with respect to that unreasonable choice by somebody else if I purposefully embrace or intend it, so that I make the occurrence of the bad thing the other person's doing my own purpose in one way or another. And so I choose in a way that is designed, that has as its purpose the facilitation or encouragement of that, okay? Then there's the separate issue, even if the impact is purely incidental, maybe my action exerts a kind of causal impact that's sufficient to materially influence the degree to which this badness, whatever it is, occurs. And so in either of those cases, it seems to me a boycott, I think would be required. It's never right for me to adopt as my purpose some evil. That's always wrong. And when I exert an unreasonable influence in the direction of some bad outcome, unreasonable as gauged, I suggest, by the Golden Rule, then that's unreasonable too. So then I look at the question of not actually of eating meat, but of purchasing meat, which is, I think, actually what matters if we're talking about an impact on the meat market. What I eat has really, no influence at all on the market per se, but what I purchase does. So, and I start out, as Dave notes, by emphasizing a point that is made very clearly by all sorts of people who don't themselves like the meat market at all, namely that that market is simply too large for it to make the slightest bit of difference what an individual uncoordinated consumer does. And so then there's an attempt to respond to this by suggesting that, well, maybe in some cases that's not true, because in very rare instances an individual purchase might push the market over a threshold with enormous consequences, and since you don't know whether you might be the person pushing the market over a threshold, you should assume that you might be, and so forth. So there's this sort of argument that takes place in this literature, and I just try to suggest why I'm not persuaded by any of that. And why I don't think that boycotts ordinarily are required in this instance. So I'm not saying no boycotts are required. I think some boycotts are, in fact, probably required, but not in many of the instances I consider here. So I don't think that symbolic actions that don't involve purposeful choices to facilitate evil and that don't have any meaningful causal impact, I don't think symbolic choices are ever required. So that's what I mean when I talk about being opposed to the invocation of the symbolic. But I can nonetheless choose to engage in a protest, as an expressive act. I mean, that's symbolic, but it's what I'm opposed to is not symbolism, but symbolism understood as some kind of moral mandate.
Okay, that helps me a great deal. Okay, let's get other people into the conversation, and let's stay away from anarchism. I nudged Gary a little bit more in that direction than I think he would have preferred, and we don't want to turn this, in respect to him, we don't want to turn this into a discussion of anarchism, but let's talk about this more generally. Edmund. And I understand that with these microphones, one must push a button on them.
I hope I didn't misunderstand you. But the natural law, do you mean that we humans are good?
Natural law doesn't, I think, involve any particular commitment on that question. It's not about whether people characteristically do good things or don't do good things. Natural law theory, as I understand it, is a theory about what it is to do good things. And that's a quite different question from, how frequently or reliably you or I or Dave or anybody else might do good things.
Okay, I said Edmund, it's Eduardo. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Because I have the impression that when you mentioned that torture and things like that are naturally, humanly wrong. And my concern is that in the Garden of Eden, the Lord said, I will put enmity between you and the seed of the woman. I mean, God put in us this influence that we can perceive bad things, not as we humanly, without God, we can do it. In regard to liberalism, you mentioned that the basic idea is to get rid of the things that to kill us each other because of religion. And my question is, I know that Muslim, Catholics, and Nazis are willing not only to die for their ideas, but to kill. How do you get rid of those ideas? How do you can liberate them of those ideas to stop the killing?
So, what I would say is, I don't want to be glib about this, right? I don't want to suggest that I can snap my fingers and then suddenly we all stop killing each other. But I think that if we look at 19th, say in 20th century Europe and compare that to, say, 16th and 17th century Europe, there's a pretty striking difference in the frequency with which religiously motivated violence is taking place. And I'm sure there are multiple reasons for that. I mean, it's one of the major phenomena of the modern world, and so it obviously has been the focus of a tremendous amount of reflection on the part of historians and social scientists. But, so one thing that I see looking at that, at least, is that the emergence of liberal ideas in the 17th and 18th centuries served as a means by which people reframed their social interactions and understood in new ways what it was to either behave or not behave well in their own lives and in relation to others, and a new set of tools for thinking about those. The scientific method arises in this period, and while it's certainly not infallible, it provides people with a new model for thinking critically about their beliefs and so forth. And so I think because of this, the attitudes that had underlain the wars of religion just started to have less purchase on people's emotions and their imaginations, and thus on their ways of being in the world. And I think as a result of that, we saw Catholics and Protestants less inclined, not perfectly. I mean, look, we have Northern Ireland in this century, but I think Catholics and Protestants were less inclined to kill each other, and different sorts of Protestants less inclined to kill each other. People became less willing to imprison those who disagreed with them religiously, and so forth. So I think a change in ideas seems to me, at least, capable of changing social practice, and sometimes in a fruitful way.
Okay, so Steven Pinker says that violence, in fact, killing people, is actually on the decline. Not percentage-wise. Fewer people are dying violent deaths at the hands of others today, quite considerably, than were dying earlier. So things are not getting worse and worse in every way. In some ways they're getting better. Here, and then back to Peter.
We got one over here too. No, you choose first.
Okay.
Regarding the list. Regarding the list or components of flourishing life.
Yeah.
Don't you agree that the individual's perception, interpretation of, and the value that person assigned to those components has to be taken into consideration? Because, for example, I'll say something banal as this. I am a soccer fanatic. If someone gives me a golf bag, it costs more, and that person might think there's more value in it. But to me, the joy I would have playing with that soccer ball might be more important to me.
Yeah, so again, I'm not interested in weighting or weighing the various categories in some kind of, I don't believe there is in fact a way of doing that in a kind of uniform and objective way. That is, I think what matters is that you, for instance, don't say to yourself or say through your behavior to others, golf has no value, but it's totally reasonable for you to say, I'm not interested in golf, and what I'm focusing on is my soccer ball, and that's totally reasonable. That in each case, as long as you don't sort of dismiss the thing that doesn't interest you as not valuable at all, it's perfectly reasonable for you to focus on one thing and ignore another. One aspect, actually, of the natural law theory that I endorse is the idea that on an individual basis, we make commitments that in various ways organize our lives and assign priority to different things for us. And it's certainly the case that we can do that very much aware that other people might do it differently. What matters is that we take seriously all of these things as components of flourishing, not that we give them all the same weights in our own lives or insist that other people somehow weight them the way we do.
Okay, thank you very much. Peter?
Rodney first.
Okay, Rodney?
Do you have any current heroes or role models, particularly within a political landscape? Like maybe, can you hear? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any contemporary role models or heroes, particularly within a political landscape? There's a lot of citation of historic people, but what about today? That's A. And B, tied to that is the message to doubting Christians. Is it really just a matter of keep doing as many good things as you can?
a matter of doing as many good things as you can, or what? What that is?
Well, in terms of a focus, in terms of flourishing.
Well, I don't think flourishing is about adding up, adding up good things. Indeed, I think, one aspect from my point of view, leisure is tremendously important as an aspect of flourishing. So I don't, for me, adding up lots of good things would be a problem. I think we know there are other people who derive a sense of value, right, from constant performance, and whose sense of their own worth really is dependent on doing one more thing. I think our late friend Charles Teal often struck me that way. Charles had to be doing stuff constantly. The Protestant work ethic was very deep in his psyche. That's one way of flourishing, but it's certainly not the only one. Role models. So I don't, no, I can't think of anybody I would say in the contemporary political landscape who's much of a role model.
Okay, there you go. Peter, thank you.
Jerry. I regard to
I think we need, on these microphones, we need to push a button, I think.
in regard to the natural law, I have a question to see your position. Usually miracles are regarded as a suspension of the natural law. What's your position in regard to this? And I have a following question.
Okay, so I'm thinking here, of course, just about natural law as a component of theorizing about the moral life, and fortunately, I don't have to take a position on this. In terms of whether we might want to define a miracle as a violation of a law of nature, understood in kind of physical terms, a natural scientific manner, I think it's a perfectly okay definition. Is if you want to use the word miracle for an event that has that quality, that's fine. Clearly, some people use the word miracle more broadly to refer to things they regard as wondrous, so that someone who might deny the reality of miracles in the first sense might nonetheless think there were miracles in the second sense. But I don't object to that definition of miracle that you've offered, Peter. Where do you want to go with that?
Okay, the following question is, do you think God can produce a miracle without suspending the natural law?
So I would urge those who are interested in my take on that question to read my book, The Analogy of Love, or to read the chapter that I did in The Future of Adventism. My own view is that if we look at the way the world is, I think about a presentation actually I did in this group a few years ago. If we look at the way the world actually seems to be, lots of bad things happen, which I think we have to take to be contrary to God's intentions. So I think we have to conclude that there is either a moral or a metaphysical reason why God doesn't prevent those things from happening. And the practical effect, whether the reading is moral, so that there's a reason that that God does this, having to do with what it is for there to be a good world, or there's a metaphysical reason, divine influence is necessarily persuasive rather than coercive. Either way, it seems to me our experience of the world ought to make us doubtful about the kind of intervention, I think, that you're talking about. I think it's conceivable, one could say, that there are such interventions, but they're very rare. That's I think, a possible position. It's just that the difficulty is squaring, I think, even that view with the frequency of awfulness that we see in the world.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Who's next?
Donna,
Donna, okay.
let me get this. Could you hand this down?
I think Donna has the last question
Right.
or comment.
There's something fitting about that, I'm sure.
Okay, I just wanted to go back for a minute.
Just push that. Hold it down. There you go.
All right, now is it good with you?
No.
See, this is why you get married sometimes.
Good to know.
No, I just wanted to go back almost to the very beginning of what you said. I don't want to get off on anarchy, but you did begin by saying, quoting the Declaration of Independence and saying that governments are legitimate when they derive from the consent of the governed, and then you say the governed haven't consented. It does seem to me that in in a more global sense, the governed have consented. Maybe not every individual in the polity has formally consented, but the fact that people stay here or even try to come here suggests that there are some common values that people see in certain forms of government. And even when you have a bottom-up assembly of individuals who assemble by mutual consent, you find, it seems to me, that eventually they need a structure for not just the individuals to relate to each other, but for the groups to relate to each other. The states eventually find it useful to have a federal government. And what I'm interested in is how you would see that applied to the Adventist Church. Should we have just individuals, groups, and is there any value at all to an overarching structure? I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
Yeah, no, I think that's a big and interesting question. So thank you for having the last word.
No, you have the last word.
Well, you have the last question. So, I think that I think that our friend Roy Branson was onto something in that infamous Spectrum piece from 1984, in which he suggested that the Adventist Church was structured in a way that V.I. Lenin would have approved of. That Lenin's democratic centralism was very much the model that he observed in Adventist church polity. We all probably remember as well when Neil C. Wilson testified in the Proctor case. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is the most hierarchically organized church in North America, apart from the Catholic Church, and my role is analogous to that of the Pope. So the Adventist Church, I don't, whatever we think about the Adventist Church, I don't think the problem is too little organization. I think my own view, at least, is that Adventism has accomplished something valuable by way of creating a worldwide community that maybe has been facilitated by the global structure. On the other hand, I think in many cases, and we don't have time to run with this indefinitely, the moves in the direction of congregationalism seem to me to be long overdue. I think the attempt to try to manage things from the top is problematic, I think, sort of on organization theory grounds, and has just had pretty discernible problematic consequences. Your body language, Dave, tells me you need to go.
Well, I don't mean to appear impatient. I'm thoroughly enjoying this, but would you mind leading us in the benediction?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Okay, we have Thor's first.
Okay, just again, if you're not on our mailing list, please stop by and sign up. And next week, Dr. Ron Osborne and Dr. Keto at the following weeks.
Right.
So.
And thank you to Bud Racine for managing our email. This is a very big contribution to our lives, and I much appreciate it.
Yeah, we've promoted him to executive vice president of the emailing list. So.
Who's the president? If that's the case.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, so let's do the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.
Amen.
Always a pleasure.